I want to welcome the members of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. I want to welcome our distinguished witnesses and guests to this hearing on the humanitarian crisis at the border. The American people are up in arms about reports both from the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security and the media and various human rights groups about the dangerous overcrowding, spreading infections, influenza, diarrhea, and lice, pervasive medical inattention, sexual assaults, and systematic abuse of the rights of migrants in U.S. government care and custody at the border. We hope to shine a bright light this afternoon on these dark developments to enable rapid and effective legislative responses. I especially want to thank our first witness, Yasmin Juarez, for coming to share the painful story of her 19-month-old daughter, Marie, who experienced untreated respiratory complications during her detention by ICE and died shortly thereafter. We know that 6 children have lost their lives while in detention at the border. I want to thank all members of Congress and this committee who have traveled to the border to investigate, and all of those who are prepared to do so in the coming weeks. The human rights violations and family catastrophes happening at the border are not improving a serious regional refugee crisis, but they are worsening and exacerbating it. What is driving this refugee crisis? Gang violence and intimidation, government dysfunction, and police corruption, political persecution, rape, and gender violence, they are all driving unprecedented numbers of desperate families and terrified children out of the Northern Triangle of Central America to the United States. Many of the migrants amassing at our border are escaping threats of imminent death or bodily harm, or the prospect of their children being forced into violent gangs or criminal networks of sexual abuse and trafficking. Some are climate change refugees fleeing the devastating effects of extreme drought and flooding in their home areas. The journey to the border today for these huddled masses is traumatic and filled with deadly peril. Along the way, many are robbed, assaulted, or raped. Some have been killed. Parents have drowned alongside their children in the Rio Grande. But hundreds of thousands have made it to our border. They turn themselves into border officials and make their legal claim for asylum, a claim that they have the right to make under both American and international law. Yet they've been greeted not as refugees whose asylum claims must be heard and taken seriously under our due process of law, but as presumptive criminals and threats to the American people. The Trump administration has prosecuted them, subjected their families to prolonged and miserable detention, separated children from their parents, and forced migrants back into Mexico. The entire thrust of this policy is punishment, both court-ordered and government-administered, and deterrence by means of mass trauma. While the Trump administration did not cause the refugee crisis in Central America, it has exacerbated it by cutting off hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid for education, healthcare, and community development to precisely the countries which the refugees are now desperately fleeing in huge numbers. We owe the region at least this aid, given that we are a key market for the drug trade that has wreaked so much violence and insecurity in these countries. And all of us are implicated in foreign policies toward Central America over the last several decades, which have emphasized war and military assistance over economic and social development. The administration's chaotic policy responses have produced a severe humanitarian crisis at the border, with dangerous overcrowding, widespread sickness and disease, and a shocking failure to provide adequate medical care, food, water, and sanitation. America is watching scenes of sick children packed into holding cells, pregnant women sleeping on cold floors, and mothers trying to warm newborn babies with aluminum blankets. The policy of separating thousands of migrant children from their parents is designed to make conditions at the border so miserable that the refugees will simply stop coming. Last May, then Attorney General Sessions stated, if you don't want your child to be separated, then don't bring them across the border illegally. But these policies are failing to deter asylum-seeking families because the underlying causes of their migration are so grave and overwhelming. In fact, the Trump deterrence policy seems to be having no deterrent effect at all. According to Customs and Border Protection's own data, family migration spiked in the month after the administration announced the family separation policy, and there have been sharp increases ever since, unlike anything we've seen before in our lifetimes. Whatever else these harsh policies are intended to accomplish, the message received by hundreds of thousands of people seems to be, migrate now before things get even worse. The administration has failed to respond in a way that meets the actual humanitarian challenges at the border. Our government should be sending doctors and social workers and humanitarian supplies to the border, along with asylum officers and legal resources to help identify and process claims. We should be making sure that all of the money being spent at the border is not being wasted, but used to meet the urgent nutritional and medical needs of the migrants. Last week, the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General warned of a ticking time bomb at Border Patrol detention facilities. The IG cited children crammed into cages with no access to showers or hot meals and serious overcrowding and prolonged detention for adults, some in standing room only conditions with no room to lie or even sit down. At the Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas, the New York Times reported outbreaks of scabies, shingles, and chicken pox were spreading among the hundreds of children in cramped cells, agents said. The stench of the children's dirty clothing was so strong it spread to the agents' own clothing. People in town would scrunch their noses when they left work. The children cried constantly. One girl seemed likely enough to try to kill herself that the agents made her sleep on a cot in front of them so they could watch her as they were processing new arrivals. There is no excuse for our government being so unprepared and indifferent to refugee flows that have been steadily mounting for months. These conditions violate American law and international human rights standards. We would not accept these conditions for refugees anywhere else in the world. The Trump administration reversed a policy, for example, that largely protected pregnant women from detention. Over 200 human rights and civil rights groups have called for the policy's reinstatement, noting the current arbitrary detention of pregnant women violates international human rights norms. Last week, the DHS Inspector General reported that 31% of children across 5 facilities had been held longer than 72 hours in violation of Flores, the 1997 settlement agreement that required children to be placed in safe and sanitary conditions and directs children be transferred out of detention facilities as expeditiously as possible. There have now been news reports of migrant children detained for much longer than 72 hours and many for weeks. There is a dangerous lack of accountability at detention facilities. We know that many officers are doing their best under these trying and excruciating conditions, but after recent reports, there is little doubt that there is a real contingent of border agents acting in callous and scandalous ways, punishing scared and helpless children, mocking migrant deaths on Facebook, and even attacking in vile ways members of Congress who dare to demand fair treatment for migrants under the rule of law. I'm pleased that the acting secretary has pledged to investigate these reports, but reportedly top Border Patrol officials have been aware of the Facebook group and its egregious contents for many months and even years. What sort of culture exists within DHS that would foster or even tolerate this behavior for so long? Why did the administration and its allies block efforts to ensure that increased funding for the border be accompanied by provisions to ensure responsible oversight over how our money as taxpayers is being spent? How can we end official tolerance for these shameful actions in our name? I hope our hearing today will bring these difficult facts into the light and pose hard questions about official actions that shame us as a society, not as Democrats or Republicans or independents, but as Americans. I also hope that this hearing, in conjunction with Chairman Cummings' full committee hearing scheduled for Friday, will identify immediate steps to provide relief and change in these conditions. I'll now go to the opening video before I turn it over to our ranking member, Mr. Roy.
report reveals just how grim conditions are inside border detention facilities in South Texas. New photos show severe overcrowding.
The incoming president of the American Academy of Pediatrics toured 2 CBP facilities last week and tells CBS News they are no place for children.
When they opened the door, the first thing that hit us was a smell, and it was a smell of sweat, urine, and feces.
Investigators also say they observed overcrowding at facilities where children are being held, and that many are being held longer than legally allowed. At 3 facilities they visited, investigators say children had no access to showers, and at 2 facilities, no access to hot meals.
The children are hardly being fed anything nutritious, and they are being medically neglected. We're seeing a flu outbreak, and we're also seeing a lice infestation. We have children sleeping on the floor. It's the worst conditions I've ever witnessed in several years of doing these inspections.
Sobre cómo estuvo el centro de detención.
No le daban poca comida, unos niños que no se bañaban, no los bañaban, los trataban mal, allí donde estábamos. No, unos niños enfermos, que allí les decía que lo llevaran al hospital, pero no lo llevaban.
Well, CBS News has confirmed that a 6th migrant child has died after crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. Previously, officials had confirmed the deaths of 5 migrant children since December. But an official at the Department of Health and Human Services told CBS News late Wednesday that an unaccompanied 10-year-old girl from El Salvador died in U.S. custody in September.
So visually, I had people there that told me the job that they are doing is incredible.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Roy of Texas, for 5 minutes for his opening statement, and I will be liberal with that.